Why do we have to choose one? With Optus, you can have it all. Get a great network with super fast 5G. Get value with 5G phone price match guarantee. Get amazing features like mobile turbocharge. With Optus, you can simply have it all. It starts with yes. 5G available in selected areas and on selected plans. Speeds vary. Check website for coverage and offer details, including T's and C's, exclusions, eligibility criteria and prices.
From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Wednesday, October 4. Chaos is currently reigning in Washington. Over the weekend, the American government narrowly avoided, by only a matter of minutes, a total shutdown. This might not be uncommon these days. It's happened numerous times over the last decade. But this time it's different, because a virtual civil war has erupted within the Republican Party, one that, according to some commentators, is unprecedented. So what will this mean for the United States and the rest of us? Today, international and political editor Peter Hartcher on how this chaos could imperil Ukraine's war effort and threaten other American allies. So, Peter, there was absolute chaos within the American Congress over the weekend. The government just managed to avoid a shutdown with only minutes to spare in a negotiation with the Republican-controlled House of Representatives. But as a result, like you've just written, Joe Biden had to sacrifice funding support for Ukraine. So how did it come to this? Because just last year, there was this strong bipartisan support for giving aid to the Ukraine. And now there's this dramatic U-turn. It seems like this is at the heart of this deal that Joe Biden had to strike in order to avoid a government shutdown.
Yes, so the only way that the House Speaker, a Republican, the only way he could get that together was, of course, with the support of the Democrats. But he couldn't get a bunch of Republicans on board for that, at least 70 and probably more, if it included any funding for Ukraine. And the reason for that is a two-word explanation: Donald Trump.
So take us through this. I'm assuming you're referring to the fact that Donald Trump is vocally in opposition to supporting the war in Ukraine.
So his history is, we know that he's had a love affair with Vladimir Putin. Plus, we know that Trump and many Republicans are suspicious of Joe Biden's son, Hunter, and his business dealings, which have involved Ukraine. So you map those two starting predispositions onto Trump and his mindset about continuing US support for Ukraine, and you get a guy who says we shouldn't be supporting Ukraine. So Donald Trump, you might say, well, so what? I mean, he's not in Congress, he's not the president, he's not in power anywhere, so how does his attitude matter? Well, the answer is the hypnotic power that he has over Republican voters, and that in turn translates into his mesmerizing gravitational pull, which attracts so many Republican members of Congress to him and to his views. So a year and a half ago, the entire US House of Representatives voted for a resolution vowing fervent and steadfast support for Ukraine. And that was out of a 435-member House, there were only 3 votes against. So that was just overwhelming bipartisan support. And now they can't get a majority of Republicans in the House to agree to that. So Trump has managed to infect the Republican Congress. He's managed to take Republican voters with him. So now in the polling, there's strong support for more Ukraine aid and assistance from self-described Democrat voters. But on the Republican side, self-identified Republican voters, 71%, I think, are saying no more support for Ukraine.
Okay, so what's happened here, though, that in a year there's this U-turn? There was Republican support in addition to Democratic support for funding Ukraine. Now there's a massive amount of Republicans who do not support it. And how central is this to what's been called a civil war that has erupted within the Republican Party?
Well, it is very, very much about that. It is very much about the so-called Freedom Caucus and the hard right within the Republican congressional delegation. So, yeah, it is about that. It's also about the natural, inevitable, apparently, public opinion fatigue that the US goes through every time it launches into a war. You start out with solid public support, and then with each passing month, that fades. The famous American historian Arthur Schlesinger famously said that all wars are popular for the first 30 days. So public support generally has faded over the course of time, and the US has been very generous. It's $116 billion US dollars, which is more than all the European members of NATO put together. So you put all that together and you can see why Americans would start to say, well, hang on, we've done a huge amount, more than anybody else. Is there a limit? Republicans who are opposed to further support say, what about corruption in Ukraine? We should be getting more accountability for where that money's going. There's got to be limits. We want to see more from other allies. So some of the specific objections and questions are fairly reasonable, but in aggregate, it brings you to a point where the Republicans aren't continuing to do what they said they would do, which they swore vehemently they would do, which is refusing to support an ally when it's under siege by a great power.
Okay, we're going to get into the broad implications of that in just a moment. But first, what does this mean for Ukraine specifically? I mean, is this going to arguably embolden Vladimir Putin?
It can only embolden Russia. Donald Trump, despite predictions that he would fade away, looms ever larger over the Republican race for the nomination. So that must encourage him to do two things. First, hold on, keep fighting, don't negotiate, in the hope that Donald Trump will become president and your enemy will lose its greatest supporter. And second, it would encourage Vladimir Putin, surely embolden him to do more to get that outcome, to get Donald Trump elected, and therefore to interfere even more actively than he did last time around in the forthcoming US election.
We'll be right back. Okay, but as you've written in your last column, the impact of the United States declining further aid to Ukraine doesn't just impact Ukraine. You say it sends an ominous message to America's allies. So what sort of message does it send? And how worried should allied countries like Australia be, and why?
I think it's an object lesson for everybody who is expecting US support in a crisis. I think it's an object lesson in the potential fickleness of the US as an ally. I mean, this is a system that can barely keep its own government running. So it probably shouldn't be too shocking that it has trouble continuing support for allies as well. And look, Samantha, this isn't entirely new. One relatively recent example, when Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister, he wrote in his memoir that when the Navy, the Australian Navy, was conducting freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, he declined to authorise the Navy to go within the 12 nautical mile territorial waters of any maritime feature that China also was claiming. Now, the Americans do sail within that limit and the Australians do not. And Turnbull said in his memoir the reason he wouldn't authorise it is because he said if we got into a confrontation with a Chinese vessel from the People's Liberation Army Navy, he said, I had no confidence that the US would be there to back us up and we could just come face to face in an escalating situation and we could face a humiliating back down. So he didn't think the US Navy was reliable even for that sort of scale of operation. So it's not entirely new, but this is a fresh reminder that we have to have plans B.
But is there any indication that our government has a plan B or is working on a plan B? Because you've written over the years that Australia has long had a slavish dependency on the United States. So could this possibly change direction here?
Well, in some ways, there are some ways in which we simply cannot replicate what the US does for Australia. So perhaps the clearest example is which other power is going to extend the nuclear umbrella to protect Australia from potential nuclear attack by a rival? Nobody. It's only the US that has been doing that and currently continues to do that. But in other ways, Australia does have very potent options for developing a more independent stance. For example, the decision to build a capacity in Australia to manufacture our own long-range strike missiles. So increasingly, the defence and security of Australia is looking for options to establish independence, and yet at the same time it's also increasing its dependency on the US. For example, the agreements to allow US long-range bombers to operate in the future out of Australia, US submarines to operate out of Australia, increasing basing and rotation of US assets through Australia, and of course the AUKUS deal. It locks Australia more tightly into the alliance. And that's okay. We've only got one treaty ally and we need to extract everything we possibly can from that. But at the same time, this is a timely reminder that the more independent capability we have, the better.
Okay, and what about Ukraine and its ability to continue fighting Russia? Joe Biden has urged Kevin McCarthy to put forward a separate package of money for Ukraine. But there have also been calls from the Republican Party for McCarthy to step down. So what's the likelihood that America's support for Ukraine will be reinstated?
Well, there is, as the congressional leaders say and as Joe Biden says, there is majority support in both parties for more funding for Ukraine. But the ability to get that through the Congress, you'd have to say there is a good chance that they'll cobble together something. But, I mean, it's just unending chaos and you'd be hard-pressed to predict anything with any certainty. And look, it's 26 years since the US Congress approved a normal budget, a full set of budget bills on time, 26 years. And it gets increasingly erratic, increasingly fickle, increasingly unpredictable each year, and all these other issues get tied up in it. So you'd be brave to put money on it, let's put it that way.
Okay, so you've mentioned there's this history of fighting in Congress over what really should just be procedural bills that keep the government running. It's led to near government shutdowns and actual government shutdowns, but now it's more extreme than ever. So how is this likely to play out?
Well, the more dysfunction we see in Washington, the more heart it gives to America's enemies everywhere. And it must give them encouragement, it must give them succor, and it must, to use the word you first used, embolden them in their future plans for aggression. This is a country that seems to have trouble running itself and therefore has limited bandwidth, you'd have to say, to conduct support of an ally or a strategy. So I don't know, but the trend is increasingly to self-indulgent, performative, right-wing extremism that denies any value in having a government, as one of the Republican hardliners said last week when it looked like they were approaching a shutdown of the federal government in the United States, which is just a ridiculous thing to say, right? But it's now normal. He said that American people won't even notice when we shut down the government.
But why did he say the Americans won't even notice? Because my understanding is if there's a federal government shutdown, we're talking about, I think, about 4 million federal workers who don't get paid, major systems shut down. So what did he mean by that? It's just so common that we're just used to it? It's just another Tuesday?
Yeah, well, that's the implication, is that if a congressman thinks that funding the national government is so trivial, I think it's just an insight into the mindset. There's performative, nutty stuff from the right. But the trend is increasingly in that direction and therefore harder to predict and therefore more difficult for ordinary Americans. I mean, millions of people on welfare payments would also suffer. I mean, many in the military would be forced onto furlough and all the rest of it. So, yes, I think they would notice, but it's getting increasingly difficult to see any stable future out of the US Congress. And remember, this is all happening, and Donald Trump, A, isn't in power, and B, the election is still more than a year away, and we're already at this juncture.
Which brings me to my last question. Does this latest chaos on Capitol Hill, is it something of a canary in the coal mine scenario? And by that, I mean the far right of the Republican Party was able to force its own leader to kowtow to a far right agenda that he didn't even want, as we've discussed. So does this foreshadow a more permanent move to the far right in American politics?
I'd hesitate to use the word permanent in any political setting, but I think in the short to medium run, yes. And while, I mean, it's a giant-sized canary in the form of Donald Trump, and as long as he is a realistic prospect for the presidency, it's a very live problem because and I'm speaking now not for the US, which is, it's their country, their problem, but it's also our ally, our problem, and a global problem. So, for example, Donald Trump, as president, flirted with the idea publicly of not honouring the NATO treaty. I mean, this is a man willing the destruction of his own country and its standing credibility and capability in the world. So it might not be permanent, but the short run, as long as he's around and the forces and ideas that he represents are around, and they are around and more present than they were even when he was president, and the broader ecosystem of American politics, then it's a problem.
So what I'm hearing is I don't think this is going to be our last discussion about this trend.
I think we're still coming into Trump season. I think we've yet to hit peak Trump.
Thank you, Peter, as always, for joining us.
Pleasure, Samantha.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Margaret Gordon, with technical assistance by Chi Wong. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.